Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Larkin, one half of the S&M Show podcast, and I'm back today with another interview. Very excited to have this individual on. It is a New York Times best-selling author. He is the new book out. It is called Second Nature. It's the memoir of Ric Flair and Charlotte Flair. He has co-wrote the WWE Encyclopedia. He's written 30 years of WrestleMania. Very talented author. Very happy to have him on the show today. It's Mr. Brian Shields. Brian, how you doing?
Michael, how are you? Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure, Brian. I mean, I've enjoyed your work as someone who's also enjoyed so many wrestling books that come out, from whether it be like the Hardy Boys, WWE done a lot with Rey Mysterio, Lita, Edge, just to name a few. I mean, even if you go back to classy Freddie Blassie's book, Pencil Neck Geeks. I mean, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking some wrestling in your books with you today.
Thank you so much.
And no problem. So first, let's get this started. Second Nature, it's out right now. It's Ric Flair's legacy. It's the rise of Charlotte. Man, when I think about Ric Flair, just one of my favorites. I was born in 1992, so I've had the pleasure, they do these posts on Facebook where they talk about, who was the champion when you were born? I would say, you know what, it was Ric Flair and Randy Savage, because, I go back to January 92 with the Rumble, with a tear in my eye, that infamous speech, and then his match with Savage at WrestleMania 8. So I got to ask you, talk about working on the book, talk about Ric Flair and Charlotte, just talk about the overall book with us.
Well, I mean, it's everybody has such strong memories about professional wrestling, especially when they were children, and who the champions were. And, for me, so much of my memory is sitting in my mother's living room, watching television, and I just want to set the stage for you and your listeners very quickly, if I may.
Go ahead.
So I'm a proud kid of the 80s, so the cable television at that point was booming. Home video, which people don't even know what that means today, with VCRs and VHS tapes and, all of those wonderful things. And professional wrestling, which has been a huge part of American culture since the advent of television, was undergoing a boom at that time. So Monday through Friday on ESPN, you had Vern Gagne's AWA Wrestling, and you would have the Von Erichs World Class Championship Wrestling. Monday nights, you would have on the USA Network primetime wrestling with WWE. It was called WWF at the time. You had a show on Tuesdays called Tuesday Night Titans. And then, your Saturday and Sunday, there was so much wrestling. And for me, that memory goes back to the Nature Boy Ric Flair. And whether it was first on WTBS Saturday mornings, Georgia Championship Wrestling, or Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA, which then later became WCW, Saturday mornings, 9:05 Eastern, and then again at 6:05 Eastern. And then it got so popular, Michael, that on Sundays at 5:05, they would have something called Main Event. So, and in between that time as well, there was a show called Pro Wrestling This Week, which I encourage everybody to check out on YouTube. It was in the 80s, a ESPN Sports Center style show hosted by Gordon Soley and Joe Pedicino, where you saw all of the different matches from the different wrestling territories around the United States, Canada, and they would show footage from Japan. So as a kid, I literally thought Ric Flair was everywhere. And learning about the NWA Championship and what it meant to be the World Heavyweight Champion, he really was. And we talk about that in Second Nature, what it meant to be the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, and the amount of traveling that would be done was just unbelievable. So, for me, Second Nature represents a dream come true in working with the Nature Boy.
Now, like I said, there's one side of the spectrum. We got the legacy of Ric Flair. We got the rise of Charlotte. Man, I remember seeing her first come in on NXT. She's doing the thing. She's a babyface. Then she transitioned to heel. Her, Sasha Banks, Summer Rae. Then to see her come up to the main roster in this women's revolution, as it's been dubbed. The four horsewomen: her, Sasha, Bayley, Becky Lynch, etc. I gotta ask you, what do you think about the way women's wrestling has evolved over the years, and what do you think about this women's Royal Rumble that we got coming up at the Royal Rumble in January?
The way that women's wrestling has evolved over the last, let's say, 4 years is really unbelievable when you look at WWE. There were many women in WWE, from the Fabulous Moolah, Vivian Vachon. I mean, the list goes on and on. Leilani Kai. I mean, there's so many. Wendy Richter, Sherry Martel, Alundra Blaze. I mean, so many. And they helped set the stage for women like Trish Stratus and Lita and Ivory and Miss Jacqueline, Molly Holly, Victoria. But the thing was that with WWE there was a lot of time where the women's matches were not focused on in terms of compelling storylines and competitive matches. And what I've seen over the last 4 years or so with WWE has been amazing, and it's a testament, and Charlotte talks about this in Second Nature, it's a testament to the women who came before them, and it's a testament to competitors like Paige and Emma, whose match at the first NXT TakeOver Arrival was really credited with starting the women's revolution, and Charlotte says that in the book. So the way that this is all transformed and evolved is very exciting. And Michael, the conversation even that we're having now, less than 48 hours ago, Stephanie McMahon announced on Raw that this Royal Rumble coming up next month will be the first ever all-female Royal Rumble. So if you look back at where WWE was 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and you look at where they are now, it's incredibly exciting. There's a Raw Women's Champion and a SmackDown Live Women's Champion who incidentally is the Queen, Charlotte Flair. And now we are a little more than 30 days away from the first ever Women's Royal Rumble. It's just incredible.
I have to say, I did check out the Ric Flair documentary on ESPN. Tremendous job. Watching Flair just tell the story and just the ups and the downs. I got to tell you, once he started talking about Reed, it did get me all choked up. It really did. And then Charlotte talking about doing it for Reed. It's really just an incredible story on both sides of the spectrum.
It really is, and it's something that Rick and Charlotte made a decision very early on. I mean, we were working on Second Nature for close to 2 years. And, they made a decision early on that they wanted the book to be true to life. They wanted their real story, the ups, the downs, the good and the bad. And it was something where, for me, it was just an incredible honor to be able to work with them and have that kind of opportunity where we're really collaborating as a trio. And when you talk about the book, Michael, I should back up, excuse me.
Good.
Second Nature begins with Rick returning to WWE programming in November of 2007. And starting that retirement storyline with Mr. McMahon and Randy Orton. So the reader right away is given unprecedented access and to Rick's feelings, his thoughts, what were going through his mind, all of those different things. And it goes right up through the Hall of Fame, WrestleMania 24 versus Shawn Michaels, the panic that he went into when he realized that he agreed to be retired, and really what that meant. And it was something that the readers are really going to enjoy. They learn about Reed and how incredible Reed Flair was as a person, as a son, as a brother, as a friend, and his battle with addiction. And then you have the entire life story of Charlotte Flair growing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, being her dad's biggest fan, but not really being into wrestling, not following wrestling. Instead, her path at the time was that of a premier NCAA Division I athlete playing volleyball. So there are so many things that are in second nature. And, you know, Michael, now the book has been out 3 months, and it's just been a wonderful experience. And I'm so happy to see that there are so many people who have enjoyed reading the book and learning about the Flairs.
I'll back up on some other stuff before we get back to Second Nature, Brian. You mentioned Main Event before in the 80s. You did also write WWE in the Raging 80s, Main Event. Man, when I think about the 80s, obviously, you know, you talk about Ric Flair, you talk about Hulk Hogan, who even said, you know, if you want to look to wrestling, you look to Ric Flair. Just so many great moments in the 80s. You think of Piper. You think of, like, Piper and Valentine and the dog collar match. You think of AWA, NWA, Saturday Night's Main Event, Hogan and Andre, Savage and Steamboat. Just talk about wrestling in the 80s, The Rock and Wrestling Connection with Cyndi Lauper in the mold as well. Just talk about that book as well, because that's just so many credible moments from the 80s.
Well, look, I will always gladly talk about any of my books, but, you know, my first book that you just mentioned came out 11 years ago through Simon & Schuster, as you said, Main Event, WWE in the Raging 80s. And it is a wonderful 200-page look into what some still feel is the greatest decade in professional wrestling. Some people view it as the golden era. Some people view it as wrestling's second golden era, because if you go back to the 1950s with people like Gorgeous George and Lou Thez, you know, that some people view it back that was the first golden age. But, you know, in the 1980s, it was a very different world. As I mentioned earlier, cable programming was skyrocketing in terms of the number of subscribers of people around the United States that were subscribing to cable television. You had the home video boom. Your older listeners will remember the war between Betamax tapes and VHS tapes. So you had home video, and professional wrestling was one of the areas that was a driving force in cable television, in home video. And then, you know, you had the NWA World Heavyweight Champion was Ric Flair. The WWE Champion was Hulk Hogan. And they were competitors. They were at competing companies. And, you know, the wrestling magazines, there were so many that were, again, sold all over the country. I mean, every month you would go to a stationery store, a drugstore, Woolworth, Five and Dime type of stores to get your wrestling magazine that month. And then WWF came out with their own magazine. So it was really an amazing time, and it was the golden age. Some say the first, some say the second, but it was a golden age for the business, and it was just an incredible time, and one that we will never quite see again in that way.
And it's so interesting too, because we mentioned Flair, we mentioned the '80s. I mentioned your book, which is one of my personal favorites, the WWE Encyclopedia, the definitive guide to WWE. So many great champions, from Bruno to Bob Backlund, Superstar Billy Graham, Hogan. The list goes on and on until present time. I got to ask you, a lot of people talk about the Benoit tragedy, and I know Chris Benoit. He's been erased from WWE's history, but. What is your take on that? Because he is a world champion, and obviously he was featured in the encyclopedia book. So just talk about putting Benoit in there. I mean, people want to erase history, but you really can't. So what is your whole take about the whole Benoit situation?
I'm happy to talk about that. And Michael, just so you know, I wrote Chris Benoit's entry for both of the first two WWE encyclopedias.
Mm-hmm.
He was featured in my 30 Years of WrestleMania book, and I'm gonna, and this happens a lot, I'm gonna disagree with you a little bit.
Okay, go ahead.
Chris Benoit has not been erased from WWE's history. He is in both of the encyclopedias that I co-wrote. He's in the 30 Years of WrestleMania book, and his matches are part of the WWE network. When if you watch those matches, so he's not been erased. If you go on even the title histories on the website, his name is on all the title histories and all the different reference books. So he's not erased. His career is not celebrated there, and that is a distinction that I hope more hardcore wrestling fans, older fans, or maybe even fans of Chris Benoit's work who feel that way, I hope that they take a few moments and recognize that distinction. And one of the things in Second Nature as well, Michael, is Rick, for the first time ever publicly in a WWE forum and in a book, talks about the Chris Benoit tragedy and gives his opinion on it, and shares his history with Nancy Sullivan, whom he knew before she was married to Chris or to Kevin Sullivan. And you learn about how Kevin Sullivan was a very good friend of the Flairs, and how Rick even said it at different points, both Nancy and Chris at different points watched all of the Flair kids backstage at different times. So, so we have a little bit of a difference of opinion there, and that's something that's very common. Anyone, and I see it online a lot, Michael, anybody who feels that they receive some sort of bonus points or credibility points within the realm of their wrestling groups that they're a part of online, and I'm a part of many. I love the wrestling groups on Facebook and different social media networks, or they feel they're being irreverent. I think that energy is misguided, and they need to reprioritize things, because the end result of that human tragedy is not something where the individual who is responsible for it should be celebrated. So if somebody thinks that there should be an action figure or a t-shirt or placement in a video game or anything like that. Again, look, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but my opinion on the subject is that energy is horribly misguided, and that individual should reevaluate what it is that they're thinking. WWE has his career in the context of their company's history perfectly placed, and that's not only my opinion, but that is also something where I have worked on it in now 4 books over the last almost 10 years, 11 years. So, and I do think people will find Rick, and I don't want to speak for Rick, I mean, it's in the book, but I think people will find Rick's take on that tragedy very interesting, and as always, Rick is very insightful, and he's very articulate in the way that he conveys his thoughts, so I do encourage people to look for that as well.
Well, personally, I'm glad that we got to talk about the Benoit thing. I know Rick was going to mention. Benoit was in the Four Horsemen. You think of his career, the Pegasus Kid to the WCW, ECW, WWE. The thing is, it's a lot of people word of mouth. I know the term erase. Personally, I don't feel that he's been erased because yes, his matches are on the WWE Network, various pay-per-views he's been in. The Nitros, the ECWs, the WWEs. It's unfortunate, it really is. But, I could personally talk about Chris Benoit as well, like you can, Brian, because the man had a very successful career.
Oh, yeah, I mean, look, and I was, like so many others, I was a huge fan of his work. I mean, one of my favorite tag teams of all time is the British Bulldogs.
Yes.
I mean, I have tapes of the British Bulldogs in Japan as a team, as individual competitors, and I don't even know how many tapes of Chris Benoit in Japan, in ECW, in Canada, Stampede Wrestling. So I was a huge admirer of his work, like so many, and but that is separate from that is one facet of someone's life, and what we're talking about here is what goes on, quote unquote, in real life, and how that needs to be kept in a very respectful context, and that's something that is very important.
Agreed. Absolutely agree with you on that. We mentioned the 30 years of WrestleMania, and you look at the WWE Encyclopedia, and just, WrestleMania, it's, the show of shows, the pageantry, just everything is revolved around WrestleMania. It's a WWE Super Bowl. You think of so many, championships, so many people who've won championships at WrestleMania. Talk about the 30 years of WrestleMania and just the great moments that we had in WrestleMania's history.
That was a very fun book for me to write. Just exploring the origin of WrestleMania, what the McMahons did, that to put everything on the line to launch the first WrestleMania, and if that wasn't a success, that basically there wouldn't be a WWF at the time, or certainly not as we know it today. And I got to talk to, Roddy Piper, Pat Patterson, the McMahons. You name it. It was just George the Animal Steele, Joan Rivers, Daryl DMC McDaniels from Run DMC, Joan Rivers before her passing. That book is a great look at the first 30 years of WrestleMania, and it does a wonderful job of chronicling the history of WrestleMania from behind the scenes as well as in front of the camera, and you see what this event has grown into today, which is the most successful of one-day single event, live event in America, if not on the planet. And the way that the Undertaker's streak coming to an end is handled, I thought was incredible. And and ironically enough, Ric Flair is on the cover of that book, and we talk about WrestleMania 8, his match with Hulk Hogan never happening, and you get great insights there from people like Bill Apter and Jim Ross. And then to know that Charlotte was one of Triple H's goddesses in his intro, it was phenomenal. I mean, I had no idea of the preview, or I should say I had no idea of the incredible project that was awaiting me down the road in working with Rick and Charlotte in their dual memoir, Second Nature.
And it's so funny, too, because I remember watching WrestleMania 30 when Triple H did the entrance. I'm like, wait a minute, isn't that Charlotte? And then I saw Sasha and Alexa Bliss in that. I always thought that was one of Triple H's best entrances. And he got to bring the NXT into the forefront on the WrestleMania stage with the talents that we would see as far as in the, not just women's wrestling, but just the future talents that we would have, because I know they just put out a new book, NXT, We Are NXT, which I'm actually also looking forward to reading, because that's another big one that just came out, and just to see where we've come from. NXT was the game shows, and then just what a brand it's become, and you also got to give big homage to the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, for that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know what, Michael? I have to. I'm sorry. Back up again.
Go ahead.
When I talk about the first two WWE encyclopedias, I do have to talk about my main man, Kevin Sullivan.
Yes.
And no, I am not talking about the Taskmaster, Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan is a good friend, an incredible writer, and I could not have had a better tag team partner than Kevin to co-write the WWE Encyclopedia with, and there is nothing like that first volume of the WWE Encyclopedia. That was the vision of Dean Miller, who has now written several WWE books, and it was a huge honor to be thought of, to work alongside Kevin on that book. And I mean, the book debuted on the New York Times bestsellers list, and stayed there for 5 straight weeks. And Kevin is just as big a part of that book as I am, and he was a great person to work with. And he's also written now since then several other phenomenal WWE books, so definitely have to give a shout out to him. And you bring up the NXT book, also a shout out to John Robinson, who's another very talented writer, phenomenal writer. So to be part of this group of writers, as well as Bertrand Hébert, who wrote the Pat Patterson book, to be part of this group of writers is very humbling for me, and it's something that I'm very proud of. And when I look back about 2.5 years ago, to know that there was preliminary work being done on a dual memoir on Ric Flair and Charlotte Flair, is, when I look back on my career, all of those wonderful things was a dress rehearsal to working with the greatest of all time in the Nature Boy, and one of the top names in the game today, male or female, Charlotte Flair. I would not have been ready to work with them, WWE, and the amazing team at St. Martin's Press, if it were not for all of those other wonderful experiences before that.
Brian, I'm going to backtrack as well now, and then I have a couple more questions for you. And I'll say I'll say right now to you, Brian, after the holidays, I'd love to have you back on, man.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so Brian, I have to ask you. This is as a wrestling fan. We talk about WrestleMania 8. We had Hogan and Justice. We had Flair and Savage, which was a great match. And I know we were originally supposed to get Flair and Hogan, and it did not happen. Do you, in a way, as a fan, wish that we did get Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair at WrestleMania 8? Because I know we got it on an episode of Raw in 02, and I know they did, I think, a match in TNA, Impact Wrestling, whatever you want to call the company now. But talk about, as a fan, do you wish that we still got Hogan and Flair at WrestleMania 8?
Yes, and we talk about that in the 30 Years of WrestleMania book. And Michael, in Second Nature, Rick goes into great detail with his entire history with Hulk Hogan, his thoughts on the WrestleMania 8 match never happening. We go into his run with TNA, which a lot of people were surprised appeared in a WWE book. We talk about Rick working with AJ Styles and Fortune, and working with Sting, Jay Lethal. So Rick's tenure in TNA is well covered in that book. Me, as a fan, there will always be a part of my fandom that will feel that that something is incomplete because we never got Nature Boy Ric Flair versus the Immortal Hulk Hogan at a WrestleMania on WrestleMania's resplendent stage, which there is not any other stage like it in sports or entertainment. And all you have to do is look at the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball and all of the other areas of sports and entertainment. Look at ESPN and how they quote-unquote borrow various TV production elements and try to create storyline elements. That's all from WWE. And there will always be a part, and that's no disrespect, by the way, Michael, to the match that Rick had with Randy Savage at WrestleMania 8. Rick talks about his history with Randy. He talks about the match. Charlotte talks about bringing Randy Savage to school one day for an impromptu show and tell as a kid.
Wow.
So for me, I will always feel that that there's a little bit missing from wrestling's history because that match didn't happen. I will say though, Michael, that they did have various matches on live events for WWE live events in New York, Boston, and on the West Coast. But they did not have a definitive one-on-one matchup at WrestleMania. And I will also add, their match at Bash at the Beach, 1994, in WCW, I do think is an excellent match. And I do think it's one of Hogan's best of his career. And I will invite and encourage all of your listeners, whether it's the WWE Network, one of Rick's DVDs, one of Hulk Hogan's DVDs, that match I thought was an excellent match, and it just showed again Ric Flair can have an excellent match with anyone at any time. Hulk Hogan was very far removed from full-time in-ring competition at that point, and it was and like he always does when the lights are shining bright, Hulk Hogan rose to the occasion. Hogan Flair at Bash at the Beach, 94, is an excellent match, and I will say that it is one of Hulk Hogan's best.
I would actually agree with you on that. I think years ago when I purchased it was either one of Ric Flair's Definitive Collection or Hulk Hogan's Anthology DVD that WWE produced. I think they had it on there, and it's also on the network now, like you mentioned, Brian. But yeah, that is a great match that both Rick and Hulk had. I remember the press conference with Ted Turner and the lead up into that. That was some good stuff.
Well, Michael, it absolutely was good stuff, and so many people look at the signing of Hulk Hogan as the thing, the event that made people look at WCW from not the wrestling purist, okay, not the hardcore fan, not the NWA fan who had their roots deeply tied to WCW by way of Jim Crockett Promotions, by way of the NWA and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. But Hulk Hogan, Ted Turner, Ric Flair, that was a very special moment in time, and to WCW's credit, they capitalized on it, and it really gave WCW the legitimacy in the business community with television networks and advertising companies and sponsors and licensees. Like when you talk about companies that make the video games and the action figures and the t-shirts, those are all what's called licensees. And the mass market casual wrestling fan, Hulk Hogan signing with World Championship Wrestling at that time was unbelievable. And then when you look at then what happened, the rivalry with Ric Flair and how pivotal that was in the launch of WCW Nitro, and then Hall and Nash coming and creating the NWO, the battle with Sting, and all of those different things that from 1994, 95 up through a certain point in 1999 made WCW a very special promotion, and one that for, was it 82 straight weeks or 84 straight weeks?
Yeah, 84.
Thank you, beat WWE in the ratings, and that was another area in the business that we'll never see again, and it was an incredible moment in time, and that really was the jump off for that was Flair Hogan.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Now, it's funny that you mentioned the 84 weeks, because as soon as you brought that up, I remember when Eric Bischoff, I was actually there the night when he became the GM of Raw back in 2002 at the Continental Airlines Arena. Oh my God. Now, that's something that a lot of people would have not thought of at the time, seeing Eric Bischoff, who was going to run Vince McMahon out of business, and, as I mentioned, 84 weeks in a row, seeing him as the GM on Raw, it's like, what, are you kidding me? That's another one that stands out in the history of wrestling.
Mike, I got to tell you that you're bringing up so many great points and great moments. It's one of the reasons why I was looking forward to coming on the show, and that was, Michael. It's funny, like if you look back at the '92 Rumble that Ric Flair won, and I promise there's a point to this.
Go ahead.
That was a very special moment in time where if you look at that Rumble and the participants, you had so many of the top names from the WWE, the NWA, the AWA, world class, right? The different territories of the 80s. You go back to the early 2000s, very similar in principle, Michael. Mm-hmm. You had the top names in WWE. You had top names from WCW, ECW, some from Japan. I mean, it was an incredible roster if you look at WWE at that time. And Eric Bischoff, whom I remember, and I'm going to date myself here, Michael, I remember Eric Bischoff being an announcer for the AWA. Mm-hmm. I remember watching him on ESPN in the late 80s, and going from the announcer that would do the intros and announcer who did the wrestler interviews to then doing the commentary for the matches. And so there were all those debuts at the time, Michael. If we think back to, even though it wasn't something that ended up being everyone's favorite, the WCW invasion. You had stars from ECW who arrived. You had the NWO. I mean, there were so many names that were coming to WWE, and I remember watching that. I couldn't believe that Eric Bischoff was on WWE programming. I couldn't believe it.
Just, yes, one of the great moments there. I actually have a couple final questions here, but yeah,
Sure.
This actually ties into what we're talking about as well, because we mentioned great moments, such as Eric Bischoff just there. We mentioned, different territories. We talk about books as well, and I mentioned some of your great books, some of the great wrestling books that WWE has produced. I actually did see this, and I wanted to bring it back, because this is old school right here, that Dr. David Schultz himself is actually coming out, I believe, with an autobiography. And I still remember the clip on YouTube of him with John Stossel back in the 2020 days on ABC in the 80s, slapping him right in the ear. Just talk about your memories of Dr. David Schultz, because that's another legend, and you also think about that incident.
Dr. D. David Schultz was someone, if you really followed wrestling in the 80s, he was an incredible villain.
He was.
I mean, he worked throughout the different territories in Memphis, throughout the Southeast. He worked in the AWA. I believe he did spend time as well in Don Owens Portland Wrestling. I mean, he went all through Canada. So by the time he got to WWE, he was one of the top villains in the promotion. And he was right there. I mean, he had an affiliation with Roddy Piper. And this is only my opinion, Michael. If you look back at Dr. D. David Schultz, some of the things that he did and some of his mannerisms did remind me years later of Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Oh yeah, badass.
And but it was and look, they're completely different characters,
Absolutely,
different wrestlers in the ring, but just a little speck of similarity there. But I will tell you, in speaking with wrestlers who were there that night, it was something that really changed the face of WWE, because Stossel was removed from the company after that. That incident with John Stossel, resulted in a lawsuit. It aired on national television. I mean, the one thing I will say, Michael, and I am not condoning, I will never condone violence on another person. I would have liked to have seen John Stossel's question worded differently. And the only reason for that is because I just think it's important to respect what people do for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And John Stossel is not the only reporter or person who's used the word fake with wrestling. But just in general, I just wish that somebody as highly regarded as a journalist and as talented as him would have used different wording. That being said, I would never condone anybody being hit. So, unless it's in self-defense. Dr. D was a top villain when that happened, and unfortunately, He kind of went into an obscurity from a wrestling standpoint, and it's my understanding that he has done a couple of these like fan fest reunions, but many years ago. If he's doing a book, I know I'm definitely interested in reading it.
Myself included. I mean, just the dude has had a great career, and yes, I do agree with you. One of the points you said was Stossel's wording of the question, because I remember he's talking about this is a business where only the toughest survive, and then John Stossel goes, "Well, I got to tell you, I think it's fake," and I'm like, I understand, like you said, a lot of reporters use the same thing with fake, but it's just he could have worded that question so much better than he stated it.
Yeah, and I've been just very disappointed over the years, Michael, with the way that wrestling, you want to call it pro wrestling, you want to call it sports entertainment, whatever it may be, is referred to, because WWE said in 1989 that wrestling was entertainment. I mean, they said that publicly.
Yes.
That it was a very physical form of entertainment, that you required the conditioning, strength, physical and mental toughness of a professional athlete, but that the outcomes are predetermined, and that the competitors are performers who are working to tell a story and to entertain audiences. So, that was now almost 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy to see that whether it's Forbes, Rolling Stone, ESPN, there are so many now mass market media outlets who are really finally giving WWE its proper due, and I'm very happy to see that. But yeah, that was again a moment in time, very long time ago now, over 30 years ago. But if he's coming out with a book, I'm definitely interested in it.
I have 3 more notes that I'd like to discuss. First one I want to talk about is you actually did some dialogue. You wrote some dialogue for the WWE 2K games, and I'm a gamer. I love the video games that WWE has produced. There's so many great storylines, great graphics with the games. Talk about writing some dialogue for the games.
You know what, Michael? It's another honor for me in terms of working on a WWE product. I have been for this WWE 2K18 was the 5th game that I got to work with the very talented team at Visual Concepts and write the announcer dialogue for the WWE 2K video game series. And it's a lot of fun. We're working on that almost year-round. And it's just an incredible honor to be part of it.
And I can tell you with the utmost sincerity in that regards, as well as with all your work, Brian, some of the best storylines are in those video games, and you guys do a great job.
Michael, thank you very much. That means a lot coming from you, and I'm just lucky enough to be able to work with WWE. My work with WWE now goes back 19 years, and it's just a dream come true. To go from, sitting on my mother's couch, diving off of the chair of sofas and dressers, trying to be Jimmy Snuka and Ricky Steamboat and Randy Savage, which I do not condone, by the way. To be able to work with the company in a variety of capacities is something that I'm just so beyond grateful for.
I did have to ask you, so we got the Royal Rumble coming up, which I'm really looking forward to. We got the Women's Royal Rumble. They announced the Royal Rumble match itself, and we now have Brock, Kane, and Braun Strowman in a triple threat for the WWE Championship. But before we get to the Rumble, We also have New Japan's Wrestle Kingdom, which features Naito and Okada for the IWGP Championship. I got to ask you, what do you think about this build that we got with Omega and Jericho?
I love it. I love the history of Wrestle Kingdom. I love Japanese wrestling, or as they call it, Purisu. Mm-hmm. And again, I can't tell you how many tapes I have from the late 70s going up through the late 90s of All Japan, New Japan, Best of the Super Juniors, so many different ones, and the Jericho Omega match is so exciting. It's another match where you just didn't think it was going to happen, and I can't wait for it.
Myself included. That card, I looked at what we have going. It's a stacked card. There's the New Japan Rumble is on it. They announced Davey Boy Smith Jr. and Lance Hoyt against Los Ingobernables de Japón for the tag titles. There's just so many great matches on there. There's Minoru Suzuki and Hiroki Goto in a hair match. There's a lot of great stuff that we got coming for Wrestle Kingdom 12. We talked about WrestleMania as well, and this will be my last thing, and then please feel free to promote your book and where everybody can purchase it. But I got to ask you, since we talked about WrestleMania as well, you also can't forget about the Hall of Fame, the spectacle that we have the night before WrestleMania. So the rumored people that I did read, and what's been going around the internet as of late, for next year's Hall of Fame, I did see Goldberg, Bam Bam Bigelow, on the women's side of things, Ivory, the Dudley Boys, and in the celebrity wing, Kid Rock. What do you think of that potential list?
I think it's a great list. The celebrity wing is another area that I would hope, hardcore fans, which I am a hardcore fan, but I wish they would have a little bit more perspective on. It is a great idea to incorporate a celebrity who has had relationships with the WWE and has done work with WWE. And I think it's embarrassing to the wrestling fan when there are fans who are not gracious to celebrities being inducted into the Hall of Fame. It's incredibly rude, and it's incredibly disrespectful, and I think it makes the wrestling fan look very bad. And a couple of years ago, Chris Jericho did a great segment about this and fans' behavior at the Hall of Fame on his podcast.
Oh, I remember that.
And, you don't... You're doing yourself a disservice if you don't listen to that. The Hall of Fame is one of my favorite events of the year. I love it, and I think it's a great class. I mean, there are some people. I would love to see Ray Stevens in it. I would love to see Ivan Koloff in it. Mm-hmm. I would love to see Rick Martel in it, who I think is an incredibly underappreciated performer. Rick Martel is one of the greatest of all time. He was a great tag team wrestler, multi-time tag team champion, was a former AWA heavyweight champion. And if you want to look, in All Japan Pro Wrestling, Rick Martel was the AWA champion and had a hell of a match with the NWA champion, the Nature Boy Ric Flair. I encourage everybody to YouTube that as well. And then you saw his versatility with the Model.
Yes.
Look, there will always be fans who want their favorite wrestler in the Hall of Fame, and it's a travesty until that happens. I understand that, and like I said, there are people every year who I hope get in. But as far as that class, if that is who's announced, I'd love one or two more people.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a great group. I'd also love like a Bam Bam Bigelow in that group. I love Bam Bam in the Hall of Fame. If that's the class, I'm gonna tune in every year like I do. I can't wait to see it.
Agreed. And the thing that's also special about that is, you mentioned the Jericho thing, and I agree with him because there are some Rude fans there. They do the what chants. I thought they were very disrespectful for many things. I think when Maria Menounos went with Bob Backlund when she introduced him and they were doing that was very disrespectful. I think she's one that should go in the wing. I've always said Regis Philbin deserves a spot in the celebrity wing. Cyndi Lauper for the Rock and Wrestling Connection. That's another one. Yeah, but
Great ball.
Exactly. Just so many, man. There's just so many.
And I gotta jump in right now also.
Go ahead.
You reminded me. And Michael, that's why I mentioned this earlier. I love wrestling. I love social media. I love the internet. I love talking with fellow fans because this is where it's fun.
Yeah.
Right? Keep it that way. The Midnight Express with Jim Cornette would be a phenomenal choice for the Hall of Fame. There are just so many, and I truly hope, I truly hope that happens, and I know it's hard. Like the British Bulldogs.
Yeah.
The British Bulldogs are one of the most influential tag teams in wrestling history. I would love to see that. I don't know if it's going to happen. Does that mean that the Hall of Fame sucks?
No.
Because the team, or like you mentioned, Regis Philbin. Absolutely. People also have to remember, Michael, there's a selection process. The talent also has to agree and have to want to be part of it. So, I just think it's important. Love wrestling with all you got. Talk about it online. Have fun. I love doing it. I do that every day. I'm online talking about wrestling. I love it. My favorite rivalries, my favorite feuds, who I want in the Hall of Fame. But also try and keep a larger perspective. This is an annual event now. And one of my favorite parts in writing the 30 year of WrestleMania book was that you saw the creation and the development and the growth of the Hall of Fame. It is now, and since 2004, a staple of WrestleMania weekend. Before that, from 94 to 96, it was an event in different grand ballrooms of major hotels before a wrestling pay-per-view, WWE pay-per-view. So it's every year. If your favorite talent didn't make it that year, they'll be next year. But let's enjoy it for what it is. Let's have fun with it, and let's have fun talking about the people who aren't necessarily in yet, but do so in a respectful way. And let's enjoy the celebrity wing, because in the end, this is a business. And if people aren't watching, if people aren't paying to go see shows or to buy pay-per-views, go to the watch the network and all these different things, we won't have a WWE to enjoy, or we will in a much smaller capacity. So those celebrity wing inductees help either bring back the casual fan, which WrestleMania does every year anyway, but they also give an opportunity to introduce potential new fans. And why would we want to turn our backs on people who could potentially come to this, learn about it, and love it as much as we all do?
Well said. Well said. Now, as an author, this will be my final question, then you can promote the social media. I got to ask you, Brian, any advice to anybody who wants to get into writing and who wants to become an author such as yourself?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to start writing and keep writing. And I know that that's a very oversimplified way of looking at it, but you need to have a body of work. Today, publishing is very different. You want to have a blog that you update at least once a week. You want to develop a social media following so that publishers look at you as a partner to help sell books. Okay, that's the business end of it. You have to hone your craft and just and write about something that you love, that you're passionate about, and that's something that you know about or that you can learn about, and go from there. I think that's the biggest thing.
All right.
So, and I tell people, write every day.
Alrighty, absolutely. And Brian, again, I'll say this right now with the utmost sincerity and respect. I look forward to having you on. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure shooting the breeze and just listen to you tell your story and talk about the many great books and writings that you've done for this past hour. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Michael, the pleasure's been all mine. I've enjoyed listening to your show in the past.
Oh, thank you.
So now for me to be on it is a really cool experience for me. So I can't thank you enough for having me on and your support. Thank your listeners. And, they can connect with me on social media. My handle on Twitter, Instagram, and my official author page on Facebook is at It's Brian Shields. So that's all one word, ITSBRIANSHIELDS. And Michael, I'm on there every day talking about current wrestling, old school video games, old school hip hop and pop culture.
Yes.
So whatever you like, I'm always talking about it, always looking for suggestions and recommendations on things as well. So I look forward to connecting with your listeners, and I cannot wait to come back on your show in 2018.
Thank you very much, Brian. And let everybody know where they can purchase Second Nature.
Thank you so much. So Second Nature is available wherever books are sold. You can go to Amazon, you can go to Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, you can go to secondnaturebook.com. There are so many different ways, but you need to know Second Nature is out now. It is the first ever dual memoir in the wrestling genre. There aren't a lot of dual memoirs out in general. And you're going to learn about the life and careers of Ric Flair. And we go back from the beginning. You're going to learn about Ric's career and Charlotte's career like never before.
All right, so from Mr. Brian Shields and myself, this has been another interview. My name is Mike Larkin, and everybody, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, people. Just, again, be good to one another, and just much love to everybody. Brian, thank you again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Michael.
All righty. Peace out, guys.